She was the last person alive who knew how to read fire, the youngest firekeeper in a 50,000-year tradition that was dying with her elders. Nia carried knowledge in her hands that couldn't be written, in her eyes that couldn't be mapped, in her memory that the colonial government was systematically erasing. The British had banned traditional burning, arrested the old firekeepers, converted others to Christianity where they renounced their pagan practices. Soon, no one would remember that fire wasn't the enemy, that for millennia, Hadza firekeepers had shaped the landscape, prevented catastrophic burns, maintained the ecosystem. That flame, properly understood, was life itself. So Nia did something dangerous. She began teaching young Hadza in secret, passing the knowledge before it died completely. And Alexander Hunt, the British forestry inspector, was hunting her. Not hunting Nia. He didn't know the woman he was falling in love with was the same person. He knew her as a honey trader who came to the settlement, who spoke English beautifully, who made him laugh, who was teaching him to see the landscape differently. He didn't know she was the notorious fire criminal whose controlled burns he was ordered to stop at any cost. That the gentle woman explaining Hadza ecology over tea was the same one his superiors called dangerous, destructive, the last practitioner who must be arrested before she corrupts more natives. When he finally discovered the truth, that the woman he loved and the criminal he hunted were the same person, Alexander faced an impossible choice: arrest the last firekeeper and extinguish a culture forever, or commit treason and become an enemy of the empire he'd served his entire life. In the dry season of 1899, in the thornbush country surrounding Lake Eyasi in northern Tanzania, Nia stood before the last fire that knew the old songs. She was 23 years old, and she was watching a culture burn to ash. Not metaphorically. The British colonial administration had been systematically destroying Hadza fire knowledge for 5 years. Her grandmother, the eldest firekeeper who could read smoke like others, read books, had been arrested in 1896 for unauthorized burning and died in custody before the trial. Her uncle, one of 3 remaining master firekeepers, had converted to Christianity at a missionary station and publicly renounced fire practices as demonic. Her mentor, the woman who had trained her since childhood, had been forced into a settled village where traditional burning was impossible, watched by colonial authorities who documented her every movement. One by one, the keepers of the sacred fire were disappearing, and with them, 50,000 years of knowledge. Nia knew things that had been passed mouth to ear, hand to hand, fire to fire since before agriculture existed. She knew which woods burned clean for medicine smoke and which turned poisonous. She knew the 17 different types of fire the Hadza recognized: teaching fire, hunting fire, clearing fire, boundary fire, healing fire, mourning fire, celebration fire, and 10 others that had no English names. She knew how to read wind 3 days before it arrived by watching smoke patterns. She knew the exact timing of burns that would prevent catastrophic wildfire while renewing grasslands. She knew fire songs that encoded ecological information in rhythm and verse. And soon she would be the only one who remembered. Then there would be no one. The thought terrified her more than any flame ever had. Fire could be understood, respected, worked with, but forgetting? Cultural extinction? That was a death that couldn't be rebuilt from embers. So Nia had begun teaching in secret. 3 students at first, young Hadza, teenagers who remembered their grandparents speaking of fire with reverence instead of fear. Then 5, then 8, now 12 young people, who gathered after dark in hidden places, learning what the British had declared illegal, preserving what the missionaries called evil, keeping alive what the colonial government insisted must die. And Nia lived two lives. By day, she was a honey trader, perfectly legal, perfectly safe. She spoke excellent English, learned from a missionary who'd failed to convert her, but succeeded in teaching her his language. She came to the British forestry settlement twice a week with wild honey to sell, sweet and golden in recycled glass jars. She was friendly, helpful, non-threatening, exactly the kind of civilized native the British approved of. By night, she was the Firekeeper, the last practitioner of an ancient art, the most wanted criminal in the Lake Ayazi district, the woman the British Forestry Service had been hunting for 8 months. Alexander Hunt didn't know both women were the same person. He knew Nia, the honey trader, the young Hadza woman with a beautiful smile and quick laugh who was teaching him to see the landscape through indigenous eyes, who explained why certain trees grew where they did, why some areas had more game, why the Hadza moved in particular patterns through the territory. And he knew the fire criminal only through official reports and growing frustration, the mysterious Firekeeper who continued practicing controlled burns despite the ban, who was somehow teaching others, who left behind burn patterns so precisely executed they seemed to mock British fire suppression efforts. He was hunting one while falling in love with the other, never suspecting they were the same person standing before him. Nia knew she was playing a dangerous game. Every conversation with Alexander was a risk. Every time she guided him through the bush, explaining Hadza ecology, she was revealing information that could help him find her secret teaching locations. Every moment they spent together was her falling deeper for someone who would arrest her without hesitation if he knew the truth. She told herself she was using him, learning his patrol schedules, understanding colonial fire policy, gathering intelligence that kept her students safe. But she was lying to herself. She was in love with Alexander Hunt, and it was going to destroy one of them. The first time Alexander tasted Nia's honey, he understood why people had been trading it for thousands of years. "It's different," he said, genuinely surprised. They sat in the shade of an acacia tree near the British Forestry Station, where Nia had brought her weekly honey delivery. Not like British honey at all. There's something wild in it. "Different flowers," Nia explained, watching him carefully. "Wild ones. The bees here visit plants that don't exist in England. Baobab flowers, acacia blossoms, dozens of others. The honey tastes like the whole landscape." "Like eating the bush itself," Alexander said, and she saw something in his eyes, not just interest, but the beginning of understanding that the landscape around him was more complex than his forestry training had taught. Over the following weeks, their conversations deepened. Alexander asked questions that went beyond polite colonial interest in native customs. He wanted to know why certain areas had more diverse plant life, why some clearings seemed to regenerate faster, why the Hadza preferred some camping sites over others. And Nia answered carefully, walking the line between teaching him to see the land properly and revealing too much about fire ecology that would connect her to the criminal he was hunting. "The land changes," she told him one afternoon, gesturing across the thornbush country that stretched golden in the late sun. "It's not static. It moves through cycles, growth and clearing, green seasons and burn seasons." "Burn seasons?" Alexander's attention sharpened. "You mean natural fires? Lightning strikes?" Nia hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Sometimes lightning, sometimes other kinds of fire, fires that help instead of harm. There's no such thing, Alexander said, not unkindly but with the absolute certainty of his training. Fire destroys. That's why we've implemented the fire ban, to protect the forest, prevent loss of timber, preserve the ecosystem. Nia bit back what she wanted to say, that his preservation was killing the very ecosystem he thought he was protecting, that without traditional burning, invasive species were spreading unchecked, that fire suppression was creating fuel loads that would eventually burn catastrophically, that he was watching a landscape die and calling it conservation. But she couldn't say that without revealing knowledge that would mark her as the firekeeper he hunted. Maybe fire is more complicated than destruction, she said instead. Maybe some fires create instead of destroy. Alexander looked at her with something between interest and condescension, the look of a well-meaning colonial who appreciated native perspectives but didn't quite take them seriously. That's poetic, he said gently. But forestry is a science. We have data on fire damage, statistics on timber loss, evidence that fire suppression protects natural resources. I know it seems harsh, especially for people who have used fire traditionally. But the ban is for everyone's benefit, including the Hadza. Nia wanted to scream, wanted to take him to the areas where fire suppression had created dense undergrowth, choking out native species, wanted to show him the sick trees, the declining game populations, the ecosystem slowly collapsing under his scientific management. But she couldn't, because that would reveal she'd been observing the effects of his policies with the trained eye of a fire ecologist, that she understood landscape management in ways his British forestry education didn't account for, that she was the firekeeper he was ordered to arrest. Instead, she smiled and changed the subject, and Alexander never knew how close he'd come to the truth. That night, Nia met her students in a hidden gorge 3 miles from the settlement. 12 young Hadza, ranging from 14 to 20 years old, gathered around a small teaching fire that burned in a rock circle designed to minimize smoke visibility. Tonight we learned to read the wind, Nia said in Hadzanin, the clicking language that encoded 50,000 years of knowledge in sounds no European had fully understood. Fire without wind knowledge is just burning. Fire with wind knowledge is ecology. She demonstrated how to read air currents by watching smoke, how to predict wind shifts by observing plant movement and animal behavior, how to time burns so wind would carry fire in controlled directions rather than letting it spread chaotically. The students watched with the intensity of people learning a language they knew was dying. Every word Nia spoke, every technique she demonstrated, might be the last time that knowledge was transmitted. If she was arrested tomorrow, if she died unexpectedly, if the British finally succeeded in stopping her teaching, 50,000 years of fire ecology would vanish in a single generation. The weight of that responsibility pressed on Nia like physical force. She was 23 years old, and she carried the entire future of a cultural tradition in her memory. "Why don't we just stop?" asked one of the younger students, a girl named Mosey who was 15 and terrified of being caught. "If it's so dangerous, if the British are hunting you, why don't we wait until they leave?" "They're not leaving," Nia said gently. "This is the empire. They plan to stay forever. If we wait for them to leave, we wait forever. The knowledge dies, and we become what they want us to be, people with no past, no traditions, no understanding of how our ancestors shaped this land for millennia." "But you could be arrested," Mosey insisted. "You could die like your grandmother." Yes, Nia acknowledged. I could. That's why I'm teaching all of you. So if I'm arrested, if I die, the knowledge doesn't die with me. You become the firekeepers. You teach the next generation. The fire keeps burning even if I don't. It was both inspiring and heartbreaking, a tradition that had passed from master to apprentice for 50,000 years now, depending on desperate secret lessons taught by a 23-year-old to teenagers in hidden gorges. After the lesson, as students dispersed into the darkness, Nia stayed by the teaching fire, carefully extinguishing it according to ritual, never leaving fire unattended, always honoring what flame had given. She thought about Alexander, about the way he looked at the landscape with eyes trained to see only timber value and fire risk, about how she was falling in love with someone who represented everything trying to destroy her culture, about how, if he ever discovered who she really was, he would arrest her without hesitation. Nia buried the fire's embers and walked home through darkness that suddenly felt like it was closing in. Alexander Hunt had been a forestry inspector for 7 years, but he'd never encountered a criminal like the firekeeper he was hunting. Most illegal burning was obvious, careless, destructive, easy to track and prosecute. Campfires left burning, accidental blazes from cooking, occasional acts of defiance by natives who resented colonial authority. But this was different. The burns he was tracking were sophisticated, perfectly timed with wind and rain patterns, located in areas that somehow benefited from fire. He could see that, even if it contradicted his training, executed with such precision that they seemed designed to demonstrate that the fire ban was based on ignorance rather than science. And they were teaching burns. He knew that from reports submitted by other colonial officers. The firekeeper wasn't just practicing traditional burning. She was training others, passing on knowledge that the colonial government had declared illegal. The reports all referred to a woman, the last trained firekeeper in the Lake Ayasi district, young, probably in her 20s, Hadza, fluent in English according to some sources, which meant mission-educated at some point. Alexander had been hunting her for 8 months, getting closer. He'd tracked burn patterns, interviewed Hadza, who wouldn't quite meet his eyes when questioned, followed smoke trails that somehow always led to cold ashes by the time he arrived. It was professional at first. Just another assignment from the Colonial Forestry Service. Apprehend the illegal fire practitioner before she caused serious damage or spread dangerous ideas about traditional burning. But over months of hunting her, Alexander had developed something approaching respect. She was careful, intelligent. Her burns demonstrated knowledge his British forestry education couldn't explain. He'd seen areas she'd burned that were somehow healthier than protected zones, more diverse vegetation, better game populations, fewer diseased trees. It didn't make sense according to everything he'd been taught. Fire destroyed, fire suppression protected. That was fundamental forestry science. Unless it wasn't. Alexander pushed the thought away. He was an inspector, not a researcher. His job was enforcement, not questioning colonial policy. The fire ban existed for good reasons, supported by data and expertise from British foresters with decades of experience. If traditional Hadza burning occasionally seemed to produce good results, that was probably coincidence, correlation, not causation. He repeated that to himself while reviewing burn sites that showed patterns his training said shouldn't exist. It was during one of these reviews that Nia found him. "Studying fire?" she asked, appearing so suddenly that he startled. Alexander turned to find her standing at the edge of a small clearing he'd been examining. an area that had been burned 3 weeks ago and was already showing new growth that looked unnaturally healthy. Investigating illegal burning, he corrected. Someone's been practicing controlled burns despite the ban. Maybe the ban is wrong, Nia said, and there was something in her voice that made Alexander look at her more carefully. The ban is based on forestry science, he said. Fire destroys ecosystems. We have data proving it. You have data from Europe, Nia countered, where forests are different, where climate is different, where fire behaves differently. Has anyone collected data here? Has anyone studied how fire works in this ecosystem over time? Traditional burning isn't science, Alexander said, feeling defensive. It's cultural practice. There's a difference. 50,000 years of observation isn't science, Nia challenged. How long has British forestry science existed? 200 years? 300? And you think that's more reliable than 50,000 years of people living with fire in this exact landscape? It was the most direct she'd ever been, and Alexander saw something in her eyes that should have warned him. Passion, knowledge, the confidence of expertise rather than opinion. But he didn't make the connection, didn't realize the woman challenging his understanding of fire ecology was the same firekeeper he'd been hunting for 8 months. It's not about which is older, Alexander said carefully. It's about systematic study versus traditional practice, science versus custom. What if your science is based on bad assumptions? Nia asked. What if fire suppression is killing the very ecosystem you think you're protecting? That's impossible, Alexander said, but his voice lacked certainty. Is it? Nia gestured at the burned site around them. Look at this area. It burned 3 weeks ago. Now look at the new growth. Look at the diversity. Look at the health of the vegetation. Compare it to that protected area over there. She pointed to a section of thorn bush that hadn't burned in years. Which looks healthier to you? Alexander looked, really looked, and felt something crack in his certainty. The burned area was thriving. The protected area looked stressed, overcrowded, showing signs of disease, less diverse vegetation. That's anomalous, he said finally. Or it's evidence, Nia replied gently. Evidence that fire isn't what you've been taught it is. That maybe the people who've lived with fire for 50,000 years understand something British forestry science hasn't discovered yet. She left him standing in the clearing, looking between the healthy burned area and the sick protected zone, feeling the first real doubt about the fire ban he'd been enforcing for 7 years. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Nia had shown him, about the patterns he'd been seeing for months that contradicted his training, about the possibility that everything he'd been taught about fire was wrong, and about the firekeeper he was hunting, who was demonstrating precisely the kind of sophisticated fire knowledge Nia had been describing. But surely they couldn't be the same person. Nia was a honey trader, friendly, open, harmless. The firekeeper was a criminal, dangerous, someone who operated in secrecy and defiance of colonial authority. They were nothing alike, except they both understood fire ecology in ways he didn't. Both challenged his assumptions. Both saw the landscape through eyes trained by traditional knowledge rather than British science. Alexander sat up in bed, feeling cold despite the warm night. Number. It wasn't possible. Was it? Nia knew she was taking too many risks with Alexander. Every conversation where she challenged his understanding of fire, every moment she revealed her ecological knowledge, brought her closer to discovery. But she couldn't stop, because he was starting to question, starting to see. And if she could make him understand, really understand, what fire meant to this ecosystem, maybe he could change colonial policy from the inside. Maybe her culture didn't have to die. It was a desperate hope, probably foolish, but she clung to it the way she clung to fire knowledge itself, knowing it might burn her but unable to let go. The night everything changed started like any other teaching session. Nia met her students in the hidden gorge where smoke couldn't be seen from colonial settlements. 12 young Hadza, eager to learn, terrified of being caught. Tonight's lesson was about fire timing, how to read seasons, how to know when burning would help rather than harm. Fire asks permission, Nia explained in Hadza, demonstrating the traditional test of reading grass moisture and wind patterns. We don't command flame, we work with it. The land tells us when it's ready to burn and we listen. She showed them how their grandmother's generation had mapped the entire territory according to fire cycles, which areas needed burning in which years, how to rotate burns to maintain ecosystem health, how to use fire to create diverse habitats. This is what the British don't understand, Nia said, her voice carrying the weight of 50,000 years. They see fire as enemy. We see it as partner. They try to eliminate it. We try to work with it. Their way creates catastrophe. Our way creates balance. It was while demonstrating a small teaching fire that Nia saw him. Alexander, standing at the gorge's rim, watching. Their eyes met across firelight and darkness, and in that moment, everything changed. Nia saw recognition dawn in his face, saw the pieces click together, the honey trader who understood fire ecology, the criminal who practiced traditional burning, the woman who challenged his science, the firekeeper he'd been hunting for 8 months, all the same person, standing before him, surrounded by students, caught in the act of teaching the very knowledge he'd been ordered to stop. Alexander's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt, not drawing it, but touching it, a gesture of authority, of threat, of the power differential between colonial officer and native criminal. Alexander, Nia started. You're her, he said, his voice hollow with betrayal. The firekeeper. The criminal I've been hunting. All this time, you've been teaching my culture before it dies, Nia finished firmly. Preserving knowledge that's older than your empire. Keeping fire alive so that young people have a chance to understand their own heritage. Around her, the students were frozen in terror. 12 young Hadza facing a British colonial officer who had just discovered their illegal fire school. 12 futures that might end in arrest, imprisonment, forced conversion, cultural erasure. You used me, Alexander said, and she heard hurt beneath the anger. Every conversation, every time you explained Hadza ecology, you were gathering intelligence, learning my patrol routes, manipulating me. At first, yes, Nia admitted. I needed to know when I could teach safely, when your patrols would be elsewhere, how to avoid detection. And later, Alexander demanded, was any of it real? Or was I just a useful idiot the whole time? Later, Nia said, her voice breaking, I fell in love with you. And that made everything so much worse, because I knew that eventually this moment would come, that you'd discover who I really was, that you'd have to choose between arresting me and betraying everything you've been taught about duty. The students watched with wide eyes, understanding enough English to follow the confrontation. understanding that their teacher's secret had been exposed, that everything might end here. "I have to arrest you," Alexander said, but his hand hadn't moved to the pistol. "You're committing illegal acts, teaching banned practices, corrupting youth with dangerous knowledge." "Is it dangerous?" Nia challenged. "Or is it sophisticated ecology that your science hasn't caught up with yet? Look at what you've seen these past months, Alexander. The burn sites that thrived, the protected areas that died, the patterns you couldn't explain with your British forestry training. Was that dangerous, or was that knowledge?" "It's illegal," Alexander said, falling back on authority when reasoning failed. "The colonial government has decided." "The colonial government decided wrong," Nia interrupted. "And if I'm arrested, if this teaching stops, 50,000 years of fire knowledge dies with me. These 12 students are the last chance. After them, no one. Fire ecology that's older than agriculture, older than writing, older than any empire, gone, extinct, because your government is terrified of knowledge they don't control." "You're asking me to commit treason," Alexander said. "To betray my oath, my duty, everything I've served." "I'm asking you to think," Nia replied. "Really think. What does your empire gain by destroying this knowledge? What does the world lose? In 50 years, 100 years, when people finally understand how fire ecology works, what will they say about the generation that let this knowledge die because of colonial arrogance?" Alexander looked at the students, 12 terrified young people who had committed no crime except wanting to understand their own culture. Looked at Nia, standing in firelight, the last keeper of a dying tradition. Looked at his hand, still resting near the pistol that could end everything. "If I let you go," he said slowly, "I become a criminal too. I lose everything. My position, my reputation, possibly my freedom. I become an enemy of the empire." "Yes," Nia acknowledged. "That's exactly what I'm asking you to become. An enemy of the system that's destroying knowledge. A traitor to colonial policy that equates control with wisdom." "Why would I do that?" Alexander asked, but his voice had changed. He was considering it. "Because you've started to see," Nia said gently. "These past months, you've been learning. Not just from me, from the land itself. You've seen that fire can heal, that traditional knowledge works, that maybe British forestry science doesn't have all the answers. And once you see that, you can't unsee it." The moment stretched between them, colonial officer and indigenous firekeeper, two people from different worlds standing at the edge of an impossible choice. "If I help you," Alexander said finally, "if I don't arrest you, if I become complicit in your teaching, what happens to us?" "We probably both end up arrested eventually," Nia admitted. "The empire doesn't forgive traitors. But maybe the knowledge survives. Maybe these students learn enough to teach the next generation. Maybe fire ecology doesn't die. Maybe that's worth it." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he removed his hand from the pistol. "Teach them," he said quietly. "I'll create false patrol reports. Cover your movements. Buy you time." He paused. "But Nia, eventually, they'll catch us both. You know that." "I know," she said. "But eventually isn't today. Today, these students learn. Today, the fire keeps burning." For 3 months, Alexander and Nia lived in the space between worlds, colonial officer and indigenous firekeeper, collaborators in a conspiracy that would destroy both of them if discovered. Alexander falsified patrol reports, redirecting colonial oversight away from Nia's teaching sites. He investigated fire sightings that led nowhere. He documented natural burns that were actually controlled teaching fires. He became, in the language of his empire, a traitor, and Nia taught with new urgency. 12 students became 15, then 18. Knowledge spreading before it could be stamped out completely. She taught fire reading, burn timing, smoke interpretation, all the ecology that British forestry science hadn't discovered yet. At night sometimes, Alexander would attend the teaching sessions, not as inspector, but as student, learning what his forestry education had never mentioned, understanding that fire wasn't enemy or tool, but partner, that humans and flame had co-evolved for longer than empires had existed. Your science isn't wrong exactly, Nia explained one night as they watched a teaching fire burn in careful patterns. It's just incomplete. It's forest management without understanding that humans are part of the ecosystem, that we've been shaping it with fire for 50,000 years. So by removing human fire, Alexander said, following the logic, we're not preserving nature. We are breaking a relationship that's older than civilization. Yes, Nia said simply. Fire suppression treats humans as separate from nature. Fire ecology treats us as participants, different paradigms. It was during these conversations that Alexander fell deeper in love with her, not just with the woman, but with the knowledge she carried. Ancient wisdom that made his modern science seem arrogant and incomplete, but they both knew it couldn't last. The British colonial administration was noticing Alexander's failure to catch the notorious Firekeeper. Questions were being asked about his effectiveness, suspicions growing about why his investigations consistently led nowhere, and then came the order that changed everything. Captain James Thornton arrived from the colonial capital in Arusha with explicit instructions. Arrest the Firekeeper immediately, by any means necessary. If local officers couldn't do it, metropolitan expertise would. Thornton was efficient, ruthless, and very good at his job. Within a week, he'd identified patterns in Alexander's patrol reports that didn't make sense. Within 2 weeks, he was following Alexander directly, suspecting complicity. Your reports show constant investigation, but no results, Thornton said coldly during a confrontational meeting. Either you're incompetent or you're protecting the criminal. Which is it? The Firekeeper is extremely careful, Alexander replied, keeping his voice steady. She knows the territory, has local support, and moves in ways that are hard to track. Then perhaps, Thornton suggested with barely concealed contempt, you need to be replaced by someone more capable. That night, Alexander warned Nia. They know something's wrong, he said urgently. Thornton's hunting both of us now. You need to take your students and disappear. Maybe cross into German territory, somewhere British authority can't reach. I can't leave, Nia said simply. If I go, the teaching stops. The knowledge dies here. This is my land, Alexander. My people's territory for 50,000 years. I don't run. Then they'll arrest you, Alexander said desperately. They'll imprison you, probably kill you. And the knowledge dies anyway. Maybe, Nia acknowledged. But there's a difference between dying while fighting and dying while running. If I'm arrested teaching, these students remember that. They remember fire ecology mattered enough to die for. That's inheritance too. It was pure Hadza philosophy, knowledge encoded not just in practice but in story, in memory, in the meaning of sacrifice. Even if the teaching stopped, The story of a firekeeper who wouldn't surrender would become part of the tradition, assuming the tradition survived at all. The end came on a night when fire spoke to Nia with urgency she couldn't ignore. The dry season had been unusually severe. Fuel loads from years of fire suppression had built up dangerously. Wind patterns were shifting in ways that suggested catastrophe approaching. "We have to burn tonight," Nia told her students, reading smoke and wind with expertise that came from lineages of firekeepers. Large controlled burns, creating fire breaks, or in 2 weeks, maybe 3, this whole region burns catastrophically. "But Thornton's watching," one student protested. "Large burns will be visible from the settlement, will be discovered." "Then we're discovered," Nia said grimly. "But if we don't burn now, hundreds die later, colonial settlements included. This isn't about hiding anymore. This is about preventing disaster." Alexander, standing at the edge of the gathering, understood what she was really saying. This was the end. Either Thornton would arrest them during the burns, or catastrophic fire would prove Hadza fire ecology right in the most terrible way possible. "I'll help," he said. "I'll coordinate with you, create official fire breaks using British methods in conjunction with your traditional burns. If we work together, maybe we prevent the catastrophe and demonstrate that both systems can collaborate." It was naive, optimistic in a way that probably wouldn't survive contact with colonial authority, but it was also the only choice that honored both his duty to protect people and his commitment to preserving Nia's knowledge. That night, they burned together. 18 Hadza fire students and 1 British forestry inspector, creating controlled burns and fire breaks across miles of thornbush country. Using traditional knowledge and modern tools in combination, creating patterns that 50,000 years of ecology recognized as right, and Thornton saw everything. He arrived with soldiers as the last fires were being carefully extinguished, finding Nia and Alexander standing together, covered in ash, clearly having worked in concert. "Inspector Hunt," Thornton said coldly, "you're under arrest for collaboration with native criminals, falsifying official reports, and treason against colonial authority." He turned to Nia. "And you're under arrest for illegal burning, corrupting youth with banned practices, and being the notorious firekeeper we've sought for months." The soldiers moved forward to bind them both. "Wait," Alexander said desperately. "In 2 weeks, maybe 3, this region will face catastrophic wildfire. Everything we burned tonight was preventive. We were protecting the settlements, including British ones. You're arresting us for saving lives." "I'm arresting you for crimes," Thornton corrected. "What happens with fires is speculation. What you did tonight is documented fact." As soldiers bound their wrists, Nia and Alexander exchanged a look across firelit smoke. They had bought time, passed knowledge to 18 students who now understood fire ecology well enough to teach others, created burns that would prevent immediate catastrophe. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't total defeat either. Sometimes, that was all you could hope for when fighting an empire. The trial was brief and brutal. Alexander was convicted of treason, sentenced to 15 years in a colonial prison. His forestry credentials were stripped, his name added to official lists of traitors and criminals. Nia's trial took even less time. Illegal burning, teaching banned practices, corrupting native youth with dangerous knowledge. 20 years imprisonment with the possibility of being sent to a penal colony off the coast. But before sentencing, something happened that neither Thornton nor the colonial court anticipated. 2 weeks after their arrests, exactly as Nia had predicted, catastrophic wildfire swept through the Lake Ayasi region, fueled by years of fire suppression, creating unnatural fuel loads driven by wind patterns Nia had warned about, burning with an intensity that no British firefighting methods could control, except in the areas where Nia and Alexander had created controlled burns and fire breaks. Those zones didn't burn catastrophically. The fires they'd set had removed enough fuel to slow the wild flames. The fire breaks they'd created channeled flames away from settlements. British colonial outposts that should have been destroyed were saved by illegal burns created by the two people imprisoned for fire crimes. The evidence was undeniable, visible from miles away, documented by multiple colonial observers who watched in amazement as Hadza fire ecology performed exactly as Nia had said it would. And 18 young Hadza who'd been trained by Nia helped fight the catastrophic fire using traditional methods, creating backfires, reading smoke patterns, coordinating burns in ways British firefighters didn't understand but learned to follow when they saw it working. Public opinion shifted. Not completely. The colonial government wasn't going to admit it had been fundamentally wrong about fire policy. But enough doubt was raised that Alexander's and Nia's sentences were reviewed. Alexander was released after 2 years, his conviction technically standing but his sentence reduced for time served. He was banned from colonial forestry work, but free. Nia served 4 years before being released under pressure from British liberals who'd heard about the native fire expert whose knowledge saved British lives. Not because the colonial government believed she'd been right, but because maintaining her imprisonment had become politically embarrassing. When they finally saw each other again, it was in the Thornbush country near Lake Ayasi where everything had started. Alexander looked older. Prison had aged him in ways that went beyond years. But his eyes were clear and he carried surveying equipment, not for the colonial government, but for an independent research project documenting traditional fire ecology. Nia looked different too, thinner from prison food, but somehow stronger, more certain. She carried a fire-making kit, the traditional Hadza tools passed down through generations, and around her were 7 of her original students, now teaching their own students. "You came back," Alexander said. "I never left," Nia replied. "Not really. You can imprison a firekeeper, but you can't imprison fire knowledge. It lives in the land, in the people who remember." They walked together through a recently burned area, not one of theirs, but one of the new generations. The burn patterns showed sophisticated understanding, precise timing, ecological wisdom. "Your students are teaching," Alexander observed, "and their students will teach," Nia confirmed. The British tried to extinguish fire knowledge. They arrested the keepers, banned the practices, criminalized the culture. But fire is patient. It waits in embers. And when conditions are right, it comes back. "Is there space for me?" Alexander asked quietly. "I'm not Hadza. I'll never fully understand fire the way you do. But I want to document it, create records that might help future generations understand what we almost lost." Nia considered. Traditional knowledge and written records aren't usually compatible. Writing fixes things that should stay fluid, captures knowledge that should be transmitted person to person, fire to fire. But times are changing, Alexander countered gently. More British are coming. More colonial policies, more pressure to assimilate. Maybe having written records, created with Hadza input, not imposed by outsiders. Maybe that helps preserve knowledge in ways that adapt to new threats. It was a compromise, an imperfect solution to an impossible problem. But Nia had learned something during 4 years in prison. Purity was a luxury cultures under siege couldn't always afford. Sometimes survival meant adapting. Sometimes preserving core knowledge required accepting that the methods of transmission would have to change. "You can document," she said finally. "But the Firekeepers control what's written. We decide what can be recorded and what must remain oral. We decide how knowledge is shared." "Agreed," Alexander said immediately. Over the following years, they created something unprecedented. A collaborative fire ecology project that combined traditional Hadza knowledge with British documentation methods, not replacing oral transmission, but supplementing it, creating resources that might help future generations understand fire, even if direct lineage from keeper to student was broken. It wasn't perfect. The colonial government still officially banned traditional burning, though enforcement had become inconsistent after the catastrophic wildfire proved Hadza methods effective. Christian missionaries still denounced fire practices as pagan. Many Hadza, traumatized by arrests and imprisonment, were reluctant to practice openly. But the knowledge survived, adapted, persisted. Nia and Alexander never formally married. Their relationship existed in the spaces between colonial categories, neither fully recognized by British law nor traditional Hadza customs. But they built a life together at the intersection of worlds, raising questions about what partnership could look like when empire and resistance had to coexist. Their daughter, born 3 years after Nia's release, learned fire ecology from her mother and scientific documentation from her father. She grew up speaking Hadzan and English, understanding flame as both cultural heritage and ecological science, embodying the hybrid future that her parents' impossible love had created. 70 years later, when Tanzania gained independence from British colonial rule, one of the first cultural preservation projects was documenting traditional Hadza fire ecology. Researchers found detailed records created by Alexander Hunt and Firekeeper Nia. Notes, diagrams, burn patterns, seasonal timing, all recorded in collaboration between colonial forestry inspector turned traitor and the last firekeeper who refused to let her knowledge die. They also found a thriving practice. 18 students had become teachers. 18 teachers had trained hundreds more. Fire knowledge that the British tried to extinguish had spread through secret teaching, protected transmission, cultural resistance that survived imprisonment, conversion attempts, and systematic erasure. The fire hadn't died. It had just learned to burn differently. Modern ecologists studying the records were astonished by the sophistication of traditional Hadza fire management. Practices that had seemed primitive to colonial administrators turned out to be complex ecology that Western science was only beginning to understand. The 50,000-year tradition had insights that contemporary fire science was still discovering. And in the thornbush country around Lake Ayasi, Firekeeper still taught students the old knowledge, now legal, now recognized, now understood as the sophisticated ecological management it had always been. Some used written records, some maintained purely oral transmission, most blended both, adapting ancient knowledge to modern threats while maintaining core practices that had sustained the landscape for millennia. Nia's great-great-granddaughter was among them, a firekeeper who carried both traditional knowledge and university ecology training, teaching that fire wasn't enemy or tool but partner, that humans and flame had co-evolved, that suppression created catastrophe while understanding created balance. She taught using both her great-great-grandmother's fire songs and her great-great-grandfather's documentation, both oral tradition and written record, both Hadza wisdom and adapted colonial methods transformed by indigenous purpose. The fire her ancestors had refused to let die burned in new forms, adapted to new worlds, but still carrying the essential knowledge. Flame, properly understood, was life itself, and love, impossible, dangerous, transcending the boundaries empires tried to enforce, had helped keep it burning when everything else tried to extinguish it. Some fires refuse to die, some knowledge insists on survival, and some people are willing to sacrifice everything to keep both burning for generations they'll never meet. Nia and Alexander had been two of those people. Their story became part of the tradition. The firekeeper who wouldn't surrender and the inspector who chose treason over cultural extinction. Not a love story with a happy ending, but a true story about what love sometimes requires: sacrifice, adaptation, and the willingness to burn yourself so others can carry light forward. The last fire hadn't been the last at all. It had just been waiting for the right conditions to spread.